Good morning, everybody. So, thank you for the introduction, Sophie. My name is Louisa from Harper Adams, and I'm going to talk about multi-species swards today. There are one or two familiar faces in the room of growers that I've visited who are involved in multi-species swards, so I know there's quite a lot of experience in the room. And we've had a lot of shout-outs, if you like, for multi-species swards over the last couple of days. So I feel a bit like I'm presenting a collection of quotes from other people's presentations, but thankfully most of them agree with what I'm going to say today. And I know that Ben's doing a workshop this afternoon, which I think is specifically more on legumes and herbs and carbon, but I'll touch upon that as well. So we have heard them sort of variously termed sort of herbal lays, diverse swards over the last couple of days, but I particularly like Michael's definition, and I wish I'd thought of it before him, of multifunctional swards. And I hope what I'm going to do today is sort of collect all of those benefits and functions, if you like, and what I'm going to talk to you about. So I'm going to start with a little bit in terms of history and why we are where we are, and an overview, really a collection of all those benefits that we've been hearing about, and then a quick sort of few thoughts at the end on some of the challenges, and some of you might be familiar with some of those challenges of growing multi-species swards. So there is nothing new about multi-species swards. In this instance, this is a commercially available mixture from the 1950s. So we can see in the green box, we've got a range of grass species, which do include ryegrasses. They do have a place in our multi-species swards. We've got a range of legumes in the yellow box, and we've got some herbs. And we often refer to those as forbs. So forbs are non-leguminous broadleaf plants which show an agronomic benefit. And we tend to use those terms, herbs and forbs, fairly interchangeably. We've got a total of 21 species there. And I think this, at the bottom there, this quote from Frank Newman Turner in his book Fertility Pastures, published in the 1950s, where he described multi-species swards as his manure merchant, his food manufacturer and his vet all in one, quite nicely encapsulates quite a number of the benefits or functions which we've heard about over the last couple of days. Indeed, if we go back even further, the over-yielding effect of using a range of species exploiting different niches in the soil profile means that they aren't in direct competition with each other and can benefit from being grown in mixtures. So that was something that was noted back in 1859 by Darwin. However, despite the fact that we knew all that, and we used that in the first half of the 20th century, grass lays, herbal lays were an important part of arable rotations and restoring fertility. But what happened subsequently with the sort of advent of readily available nitrogen fertilizers and an armory of pesticides enabled us to specialise, and the grassland moved away from the east because we weren't reliant on it in our arable rotations to achieve good cereal yields. We could do that now without grass in the rotation, and the grassland area became sort of polarised in the west. And over that period, we also saw an increasing move in our grassland areas towards sort of monocultures of ryegrasses, although we're using different varieties in our mixes. They were based mainly around ryegrass, but very reliant on high inputs of fertiliser, which we know, are demanding in terms of fossil fuels, and high inputs of pesticides. So we forgot about a lot of what we knew in terms of the benefits of herbal lays or multi-species swards. More recently, we've seen, and that's evidenced by the number of times they've been mentioned over the last couple of days, we've seen a real resurgence of interest by all stakeholders really for their environmental sustainability and a range of the other benefits that I'm going to talk about. And not least, very recently and very pertinent, the big increases in input prices that we've seen. So I'm going to focus in a little bit more on some of those benefits around productivity, the benefits to livestock, benefits in terms of nitrogen fixation, above and below ground biodiversity, a little bit on some of the incentives that are available, and then soil health. It's quite difficult to separate out some of these benefits in terms of soil health because they are all very sort of closely linked, but we'll try to do that. So I'm going to start by looking at productivity and yield, and I appreciate you can't hope to look at detail on here. But what we've seen over the last 10 years is a lot more sort of organised research into multi-species swards and some really useful outputs from some of those. And the majority of those, which were nicely collected in a sort of systematic review, show either no penalty in yield or some advantages in yield. There are exceptions to that, admittedly, and that is at reduced nitrogen levels. We cannot pretend or claim that multi-species swards will outperform very highly fertilised ryegrass monocultures. But when we take into account all of the other benefits that we're going to talk about today, then we can see an overall benefit or advantage. Resilience to a range of environmental conditions has also been mentioned, and I think Angus talked a little bit about infiltration rates and things. So there is no doubt that we are seeing more periods of drought and also more extreme rainfall events. So some of the deeper rooting grass species, so notably copsewood, and the deeper rooting herb species, such as the plantains or ribbed grasses and chicory, have a benefit to bring with the deeper rooting, helping to mitigate against drought. And some of you will have seen on farm in dry years, multi-species swards outperforming ryegrass lays in those dry periods. Ryegrass, whilst we do see quite an impact on productivity of ryegrass above 25 degrees, it does still have a place because it does show quite rapid recovery from drought conditions in most circumstances. Equally important, sort of somewhat contrastingly, is their role to play in terms of mitigating against flooding. So the deeper rooting, the improvements in organic matter levels and soil structure can help to increase infiltration rates and help to mitigate against flooding. And in fact, one of the sort of downfalls of our focus on ryegrass swards has been their lack of sort of resilience to that range of environmental stresses. Even though we've bred more stress-tolerant ryegrass varieties. When we start to look at some of the benefits to livestock, we can look at intake and performance. So the Smart Grass project, where they looked at a range of mixtures under reduced nitrogen inputs. They saw that average daily gain from birth to slaughter was lowest for the perennial ryegrass sward and was highest and with a simple mix, and that was a mixture of 2 grasses, 2 legumes and 2 herbs. Other studies, the nature of research is that we will see some differences and some contradictions. And the other thing to bear in mind is that lots of this is based on, and some of those yield results are based on trial plots in what is not a controlled environment to the extent of being a glass house, but a lot of the variables are more controlled than they will be on the farm. So we will see more variation in terms of yield, in terms of productivity on farm than we will in some of the experimental data. What we've also got in increasing the diversity of species is a wider range of growth patterns, and thereby we can extend the grazing season as well, which is important for some of you. Another function of interest in terms of livestock is mineral content. So our highly productive, highly fertilised ryegrass swards, we've seen some dilution in the dry matter of mineral content. Where we introduce deeper rooting species, so the deeper rooting grasses and the herbs, we're mining the soil profile at different depths for minerals. So we tend to see in our multi-species swards the highest selenium and iodine concentrations in the herbs, and they are minerals that are quite commonly deficient in our sort of conventional pasture systems. We see high concentrations of manganese in our grasses, and then copper, cobalt and iron in our legumes. So it's a lower cost way of providing minerals, and it's also more balanced. It's balanced with intake and with body weight compared to when we provide minerals through licks or boluses. I think a number of people have touched upon some of the anthelmintic properties. I have a crop background rather than a livestock background, so it's definitely not my area of expertise, but there's lots of research out there that shows that the condensed tannins in some of the species, so here we've got sainfoin, bird's foot trefoil and chicory, which are the species which are particularly linked to anthelmintic properties, can help to reduce internal parasites in livestock. And that was evidenced again in that Smart Grass project, where the number of wormers moved or was reduced from 2.5 in the perennial ryegrass only swards down to 1.4 and 1.5 in their simple and complex multi-species mixtures. So we all know, moving on from the livestock benefits, we all know about the tremendous benefits of legumes in terms of fixing nitrogen. And that capability is directly related to the biomass of legumes in the sward. So the more we've got of them, the more nitrogen we'll fix. And you'll know that even if you're just growing those binary mixes of ryegrass and clovers. And actually, introducing clover in terms of many of these benefits the simple act of introducing clover will bring you many of these benefits before you even start thinking about herbs. So we see, again, there will be variation in terms of legume species and management of things and soil type, but we see in the range of 25 to 35 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of dry matter of legume in the sward. That obviously represents quite significant cost savings at the moment, but is also very important in reducing those carbon emissions, because we know, and we've seen it over the last couple of days, the manufacture and the application in terms of nitrous oxide emissions that are associated with manufactured nitrogen fertiliser. And that also is obviously bringing a source of protein in the diet and replacing the need for some of those brought-in sources of proteins, and again, in terms of carbon, the emissions that might be associated with their production and transport around the world. We can also talk about benefits in terms of biodiversity. So the increase in the range of species, particularly the flowering herbs, helps to extend the flowering period within the sward and provides resources for pollinators. But we also need to think, as many people have over the last couple of days, about what they are bringing below ground. So again, I think John from Devonish yesterday gave some figures on the increase in earthworms they've seen. And what we also see with the range of species is that each species has a different sort of microbial or profile of microbials and microbes that associate with them. So overall, we see increased microbial diversity in the soil, which is really important in terms of nutrient cycling and organic matter. Some incentives are also always nice, but perhaps we need to be a little bit cautious. So some of you, I know, are involved in countryside stewardship and the GS4 option for legume and herb-rich swards. We need to be a little bit cautious in terms of quite particular botanical outcomes are required there, and they can be quite hard to achieve and maintain, and take away some of the flexibility in terms of how you're going to use them. But that is certainly an option. And then there are some options under the sustainable farming incentives as well, to increase the diversity of swards of the different standards. We see different levels of requirement for diversity. That is all recognition that actually of some of these benefits, the fact that you can be rewarded for them. So, moving on to think a little bit about soil now, and as I said, it's quite difficult to kind of pull the things apart here because they're all so interdependent, but I've tried to do that a little bit. So, thinking firstly about soil structure, and we've seen the benefits of improvements in soil structure to sort of infiltration in particular. But those deeper rooted species, the cocksfoots, the plantains, the chicories, and the yarrows, help to break up compaction in the soil profile, and we know, that compromises productivity and compromises environmental resilience, and also gives us more channels for water and air, which helps with that nutrient cycling and maintaining that population of microbes in the soil, which are cycling the nutrients and breaking down the organic matter. We've also seen plenty of evidence for more earthworms and the benefits that they bring to soil structure. So organic matter and multi-species swards. So we see increased levels of organic matter and soil carbon in our multi-species swards. It's partly due to the fact that we're exploiting more of those different niches in the soil profile. We've got more roots and therefore there's more cycling of those roots and they're producing more exudates. Legumes are important in this because the nitrogen that they are fixing is a substrate for feeding those soil microbes which are involved in that nutrient cycling and breaking down that organic matter. We do need to be careful because I think we were talking about it in the last talk in terms of sort of potatoes, and you're almost going back and you're disrupting these things. But increasing soil organic carbon is a very slow process, and we need to be careful about sort of not reversing those gains that we make. So thinking just a bit more about carbon and I suppose achieving net zero, and which species are important in terms of carbon. So we've already talked about the legumes and their importance in reducing inorganic nitrogen use and the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with that. They're also important as a source of protein, and again we've seen some evidence of some species having the capacity to reduce methane production in ruminants. And I think somebody this morning spoke in a little bit more detail about that. So legumes are important in this role in reducing carbon. The deeper rooting species are important because they are allowing plants to access more water and nutrients, and therefore the enhanced productivity and increasing organic matter levels and return of carbon inputs to the soil. Those deeper roots are also very important as a conduit for carbon to be incorporated into the deeper soil horizons, where carbon sequestration is currently less. So we've got a sort of a storage capacity there that's been underutilised by our relatively shallow rooting species, and we've got something sitting there waiting to store more carbon for us if we can get roots to go down there. We mustn't forget, and I've said several times that they do have a place, that our productive species, the ryegrasses, which are fast to establish and highly productive, are important in returning lots of organic matter to the soil. So they are an important part of our multi-species swards. If we're thinking specifically about carbon and how to manage them, it's really about managing or maximising productivity and therefore the efficiency of that sward. So we need to be selecting species which are suited to our situation. Unfortunately, that may be a little bit by trial and error or local experience, trying to work out what works and what doesn't. It's also about grazing management. So rotational and mob grazing systems are best in terms of maintaining the diversity of the sward and also in the amount of organic matter and carbon that they are returning. But obviously we've got some requirements around that. And correct fertilisation, so not applying excessive or unnecessary nitrogen fertiliser to our swards. There are some challenges, and some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with those. So we are looking at higher seed costs, and we need to ensure good establishment to get that diversity. So we're looking at fine seed beds, which we're familiar with for establishing grass. But for some of those herbal species, we're really looking for soil temperatures of 8 to 10 degrees to get that good establishment. We do see problems with persistence, particularly with some of the herbal species, and that's where grazing management, and Angus talked about set stocking and allowing selective grazing. We see a quicker decline in some of those species. Weed control is a challenge. So vigorous swards, as we know with conventional swards as well, can suppress weeds, but gaps created through the decline in those herbs can create opportunities for weeds. And I purposefully crossed out herbicides because multi-species swards herbicides, you might as well forget it, and you will not find a herbicide which is selective to all the species in your sward. I'll just pick out a couple of points on grazing management, some of which I've already covered, but the estimation, we're quite good at estimating productivity of our conventional ryegrass swards, and most of those models for measuring grass are based around that. It does become more difficult, and we have less experience in quantifying productivity of our herbal lays. We've touched upon weeds, and sort of Angus also talked about rest periods and residuals a little bit, and the benefits of rotational or mob grazing. You do hear some concerns around cutting, and some of that's based around the fact that our herbal species tend to be lower in dry matter. So they might need a longer wilt period and potentially the use of additives compared to our conventional swards. We need to select species that mature relatively simultaneously for cutting. As we're familiar with, we select ryegrass varieties that head in a shorter period when we're looking at cutting for conventional maize. And we need some of the more competitive species that will withstand that sort of cutting regime. So we see, commercially available multi-species mixtures that are designed for cutting. So just to conclude, there is an awful lot to be gained, and I think you will have gathered that even before I stood up here from what people have said over the last couple of days. And that's in terms of both productivity and many aspects of sustainability, not just environmental, but economic as well. We do have more to learn, probably on the sort of other ecosystem services that they can offer us, and we need to measure those a little bit more. We've had some work trying to do that, and looking at infiltration rates and things here at Harper. And we need to perhaps understand a little bit more about some of those interactions with livestock of some of the species as well. And an area perhaps where we do need a little bit more input from breeders and a bit more work is on the persistence of some of those herb varieties, because they tend to be the things that we are losing first in our herbal lays. So thank you very much for listening, and as I do feel I've just collected quotes from other people's talks, but hopefully that's brought it together for you a little bit.